there's bad backgrounds and bad locations and bad influences, but ultimately children are good, and on a Friday night they probably have more time on their hands and they want to do something rebellious or different, if you put on an intervention at that time, whether it's basketball or chess or football, you will have an improvement in behaviour.
Innovations in Sustainable Finance, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Julian Köbel. Hello and welcome to another episode of Innovations in Sustainable Finance. I am Julian Köbel, Assistant Professor of Sustainable Finance at the University of St. Gallen. As nearly everybody is watching football these days, with the European Championship going on, I thought it would be really fun to do a podcast about football and the connection of impact investing and football. And I really owe a big thanks to Liam McGroarty, a listener to the podcast, who reached out and introduced me to a whole new field of people who think about the impacts of playing football, especially in the social domain. There are lots of opportunities. And Liam, it's great to have you on the podcast.
It's lovely to be here too, Julian. Thank you.
To kick us off, can you tell us what do you do and how did you end up working in football?
So, first of all, I really enjoy your podcast. So very well done on that.
Thank you.
I came across your podcast when I was doing a little bit of research on impact investment in sport, and that's probably why we're having the podcast today. My background in sport goes back about 19 years. I spent 8 years at the Football Association of Ireland, my home country, and I had various roles there from grassroots to high performance. And about 11 years ago, we moved to Switzerland as a family, and I took up a role in world boxing, and I oversaw 2 global competitions where boxers were qualifying for the Olympics in Rio. And in 2016, I moved into UEFA and started working with our national associations like the Swiss Federation, helping them to strategize on how to grow football. I don't have an academic background in sport or indeed in finance. Rather, I studied theology and philosophy, so I happened upon sport as a career, mainly because when I was teaching in school, kids wouldn't listen to me talking about God and religion, but they would listen to me when I was coaching them on a football pitch, and that's how my kind of career in football started. I started doing coaching courses and ended up working in our national federation for about 8 years.
Fascinating. And are you a sportsman yourself, though? Do you play?
Yeah, so I come from a big family. So we are 7 boys and 1 girl. So from very early on, there was competitions, even just to have your breakfast before somebody else. So we're a very competitive family, and we played all kinds of sports, from ballet to basketball to football to drafts. We were very active in sport. I didn't play professionally. I coached at a high level. I play with an over 50s team, and I like to stay active. I like sport. Yeah, I didn't play at a high level, or I don't have a professional background in sport.
Yeah, but you've been on the pitch every now and then. Thank you very much. Fascinating background, how you moved from religion to football. Now, the idea that football is medicine really has been around for a while, I've realized. In fact, I read that even Voltaire, in his days, he was convinced that playing football was a treatment for all kinds of ailments. So is that just a hunch? I mean, it sounds convincing at the surface, or is there scientific evidence to back this up, that football really has some positive effects on society?
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of research on the health benefits of sport and football. Probably moving on from Voltaire's days, you've got the guru today is a guy called Peter Krustrup. He's the professor in the University of Southern Denmark, and he's coined the phrase that football is medicine in the modern era. Over the past 15 or so years, he has published so many interventions in things like the British Medical Journal and the Lancet, where there's causal links between football participation and increases in bone density, or decreases in hypertension, or improvements in treatment for certain patient groups like prostate cancer patients. And outside of that research, you've got entities like the World Health Organization, the various UN agencies. They all speak about the benefits of sport. And even at a personal level, like we know it anecdotally as well, we feel better when we're active, both mentally and physically. And more recently, there's been a movement at kind of primary care, so at your local doctor level, where doctors prescribe physical activity as an anecdote or as a prevention. So yes, it's been around a long time, but there's a lot of science behind it today.
And there is the medical aspect, and I suppose there is a trade-off. People also sometimes get hurt playing football, of course, but the net benefit perhaps is positive. I'm mentioning it because one of my students is actually in the hospital right now because of a football-related injury. But beyond the medical aspect, there seem to be also social benefits. Can you go into these a little bit?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of social benefits. Maybe to give a little bit of background into the work that we do in UEFA in 2017, we started looking at the impact that amateur football has on individuals and in communities. We could see lots of research on things like, the health benefits, reductions in crime, improvements in educational performance and so on. So we were trying to really put a monetary value on that. I know Georgia played football a few nights ago, and it was lovely to see them beating Portugal. But in 2016, we had a meeting with the Georgian FA and the other former Soviet states and a couple of southern countries. We had the ministers for sport and the Football Federation's president, and we spoke to them about all the benefits that football can give to a society. And they rightly said to us, well, put a monetary value on that or give us a business case. We're not just going to accept UEFA's word on it. So we actually pulled together a lot of researchers and academics and econometricians to actually pinpoint what are the benefits, and things like crime prevention, which you wouldn't automatically think about when you think about sport, is a very clear one. And this is research that would have causal links between reduction in antisocial behaviour and crime and football. There's a Professor Rosie Meek from Holloway University, who's a global expert in sport and criminology, and she would have analysed interventions called late night football, where children who are known to the police play football at 9:30 on a Friday night, and crime decreases by 64% during those interventions, and it goes back to 100% when the intervention stops. And that's quite longitudinal research conducted by a very, very good expert in the area.
Fascinating. So is that on purpose, strategically timed on Friday nights when most things happen?
Exactly, yeah. So there's a saint called Don Bosco. He's an Italian guy who used to say there's no such thing as a bad kid. And it's something that I would subscribe to. There's bad backgrounds and bad locations and bad influences, but ultimately children are good, and on a Friday night they probably have more time on their hands and they want to do something rebellious or different, if you put on an intervention at that time, whether it's basketball or chess or football, you will have an improvement in behaviour.
That's fascinating, and I think it's so hopeful because it is indeed very hard to fight crime among youngsters. It is difficult, and repression, which is an alternative, doesn't always work that well. We know that. So those are encouraging studies. Thanks for sharing. Do you know where this has been conducted, this research?
Yeah, so the example of the 64% increase is, I think it's about 15 years of annual research in the city of Dublin. And it's a very specific intervention because the programme is run by Football Association staff and the police force. So the police force actually, they organise, they referee, they recruit the players.
Do they play in the game too?
Sometimes they do, but generally not, because the kids are a bit younger and it probably would be too much of an opportunity to tackle a police officer when you shouldn't tackle them. And But anecdotally, there's some amazing stories too. Like there's been some crimes, serious crimes, solved because of the connection between the young people and police. Like they develop a mature, healthy relationships with what the police, as opposed to seeing them as somebody, that's against them or someone in authority.
How encouraging. Very nice. Now, as always in these impact assessments, right, it is the counterfactual is of paramount importance. Do you think a lot, what would these kids be doing otherwise? There may be those that, would like to play sports anyways, and then they happen to play soccer. What about those who would do something completely else? How do you think about that?
It was one of the most important things that we built into our impact evaluation model. We would have looked at research conducted by the World Health Organization on physical activity, and even like UNESCO and the Commonwealth would have done an enormous amount of work on sports indicators related to the SDGs. So there's lots of evidence showing that there is a connection between better social outcomes and sport. And that's fine, but we wanted to dig a little bit deeper because, as you say, the kid could play basketball or go boxing or play golf or whatever it might be. So how can you claim the benefit for football per se? So what in our research and the methodology we've come up with, we build in counterfactual if we don't have research that shows a causal link to the benefits. And the way we do that is we look at generic and specific physical inactivity levels in a country. So just to make that concrete, if you've got 100 women playing football in St. Gallen, we would look at that age profile of women, let's say they're 40 to 50, and we would say, well, what is the physical inactivity rate of that cohort of women? And most likely it's about 35%. So of those 100 women, we would actually only count 35% in our model, because the remainder would most likely take up another sport if it wasn't football, because they have that mindset to be physically active, to enjoy sport, etc. So that's how we build in a kind of discount which kind of caters for counterfactual or dead weight. It's a significant discount, and when you look at population groups that are at a higher risk of, say, a poor social outcome. So let's say if you've got a football program for middle-aged men who are a little bit overweight, so they are actually a higher risk profile for type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and so on. But we still apply the same discount as the physical inactivity rate, as opposed to the enhanced or the increased risk reduction of that particular cohort of people.
Right. So that's interesting. Even though you don't, of course, in every case know what the counterfactual would have been, you try to be conservative in the estimates you take and say, well, a fair chunk of those people would have been playing some sports one way or another. I see. And then the other point you make is very interesting. There are people for whom playing a little bit of football would make a massive difference, either because they, don't descend into some criminal activity on Friday evenings, or they improve their overall health and well-being. And is that being taken into account, sort of the reach of football programs towards these high-risk groups?
There are very specific pieces of research on specific interventions, and maybe I can draw on two of those just to show, the way we would evaluate them. So again, in Ireland, there's a football intervention for middle-aged men. And when these men were interviewed and measured at the beginning of the sports intervention, 80% of them said they felt that their fitness levels were good, although 83% of them, when we analysed them, were obese or overweight. So men underestimate how healthy we are. And when these men they went through a year's programme of playing football twice a week, and the measurements, the metrics were incredibly powerful. So all of them reduced waist circumference by between 3 and 5 centimetres, which is an enormous benefit for that metric is a really important one, because it is an indicator of so many other cardiovascular and non-communicable diseases. So waist circumference and blood pressure are really important metrics. So all of these men have seen a significant improvement in their metrics. So we developed an SROI model based on that, because we were able to then identify the cost savings to the Ministry of Health, because there's less insulin being prescribed, there's less presentation for cardiovascular disease at a GP or at an A&E centre. Another example then would be from Scotland, where kids who live below the poverty line, so there were 6 types of families where children are more likely to live below the poverty line. So families of one parent, or where both are unemployed, or one might be a substance abuser. These types of families, their children are more likely to be living below the poverty line. These parents were offered football as an after-school activity for free for their children. And these children would be in cycles of not attaining good results in school and not completing school. It's a vicious circle for these children to try and get out of that difficulty. And when these children were offered after-school activities, which included doing their homework, having their dinner and playing football, their improvements in their grades and their attendance at school was just remarkable. We then tried to put a financial value on that.
It was a combo package, homework, dinner
package,
and football.
Yeah, exactly. So dinner, football and homework. And there are 4,000 children on this programme in Scotland. And today the Ministry for Education, so after school carers, is paying football clubs £4 million a year for this intervention, because they can see it's breaking the cycle of poverty. And not only for the children, but a lot of the mums of these kids would have come to the club, started to network. Some went back hairdressing, some went on to third level to try and go back into training, just because they built that kind of social cohesion. Because a lot of loneliness takes place when kids and families are stuck in poverty. They live alone. And you can't count every benefit, but some benefits we can put values on.
Interesting. Now, if we move to the aggregate numbers, because there are a number of reports that tally it all together, what the benefits are. The numbers are impressive. Can you tell us something about your estimated total economic value of football?
Yeah, it's a funny one, Julian. It's nice to speak about the big numbers, and they are impressive. You look at countries like Germany, we would have looked at their amateur football kind of footprint in terms of an economic footprint, and it's about 4 times bigger than the Bundesliga as a professional entity, like the return for the state. But I think it's also important to look at the smaller numbers and to complement the numbers with the stories as well.
But could you still give us the numbers, please? Because I think listeners will be dying to know now what the numbers are for Germany, for instance.
Yeah, so the number for Germany, this would have been a study, we would have completed the study in 2020 or the end of 2019. So Germany has approximately 2 million registered football players. And when we look at the cost savings due to improvements in health and the lifetime value of children doing better in school, committing less crime, being employed more, and then things like social capital, social cohesion, subjective well-being, it's worth about €13.9 billion to the German economy in terms of cost-saving economic activity or lifetime value. And we break those down. It's important to break those down because that's not, economic activity. It's a mixture of, some of that is a cashable saving value, some of it is a lifetime value. So a child that goes to school more often, a child that plays team sports in school, they do 1% better in their exams. They're more likely to go to college. They're more likely to get a better job, pay higher taxes, and be employed for longer. And we can calculate that on an annualized basis, what that would be to the state as a lifetime value. And things like subjective well-being, social cohesion, social capital, these are ways of measuring and putting a financial value on social benefits, which don't lead to GDP, but there's a move away to, towards a well-being economy, not just looking at the financial performance of a country. We look at, what it was like to live in the country as well, and so on.
One benefit, and I appreciate you wanting to tell the story behind the big numbers, but one benefit of the big total numbers is, of course, that you can go to a government and say, look, this is the return that accrues to you as a country. So this is, a ballpark of what you might be willing to invest into this activity. Isn't that the way it's being used also?
Exactly. And what we have found is that governments want the business case presented to them. They want the big number. Like, they're very happy to hear that. They want to see the evidence that there is an impact and to quantify that in financial terms. Like, most sports ministers, prime ministers, ministers for finance want to see improvements in their country. And if we can show evidence that, yes, there is an impact because of football and that we quantify that in some capacity, that's of benefit to them. We've had some very positive results, over the years. I remember in 2018, we presented the results to the Polish government, and they had never invested in grassroots clubs. They'd invested in lots of things in sport, but mostly around high performance and elite programs. But on the back of our numbers, they committed 40 million of annual investment in grassroots facilities, which is an enormous help to community clubs and allowing greater access at a local level. So the numbers are really important. Big numbers open a door and they get you an ear. I think then you have to get to the detail. It's really important then that you can narrow it down to an annualized saving, a lifetime value, an individual value, and speak about it in a more nuanced way, because ultimately there can be more than government interested in investing in football and sport for social outcomes. There are more interest today, especially around the ESGs and CSRD reporting. There's more interest from the corporate sector to invest also in social outcomes.
Right. And I suppose it is very important how the budget, once it's allocated, is being spent. Right? There's a wide array of things from a public perspective now you could do in terms of promoting soccer, isn't there?
Exactly. And, if you look at the annual spend across the EU 27 on sport and recreation, it's a very small number. On average, it's 0.7% of GDP. There are some
0.7%.
outliers. Switzerland is one of those. The likes of Iceland would be in the high 11 or 12% of GDP is spent on sport. Finland, Germany, Netherlands, across the Nordics, they're quite good. You can also see whether there's a direct link to it or not, there are a lot more physically active people in those countries as well. So if you invest in sport and recreation, it looks like you will get more people to be physically active, and then there are benefits to the state because you're going to have a lower health bill. People will live longer and live healthier for longer, and so on. So there's a good argument to invest in it. Historically,
Can I come in? Sorry to interrupt. Is it a rich country phenomenon to some extent? Just the countries you've mentioned, is there an example of a country that isn't economically very strong, but nonetheless has a high allocation towards sport and recreation in the budget?
There's a lot of moving kind of pieces to it. So the other element in those countries is that volunteerism is really high as well. So it's not just the investment by government, but if you take, for example, in the Nordics, I think Norway is about 96% of their children will play sport in a club, but that's completely done by volunteers. Like, there are hundreds of thousands of volunteers. So it's a mixture of both government investing in facilities, programs, people, but it's also that volunteer movement, which has a religious, background as well. In those countries, Lutheranism is quite strong and volunteerism is a strong tradition, and that's important. Whereas if you go east and south, there's less government investment and there's also less from the community. And the knock-on effect is, we have a very interesting stat that, if you're a little boy or girl growing up in Moscow, you compete with about 80,000 other boys and girls for a place on a football pitch. If you grow up in Manchester, you compete with 800. And that's down to the fact that local government and local communities are invested in their clubs. And that's the difference.
That is a huge difference indeed. So we've been laying the groundwork for the benefits of football and we've discussed it from a public policy perspective. Now let's move to the investment case. So can you give me an example of a social impact investment into football? Does that exist yet?
Yes, it does. Some of you may know that impact bonds or social impact investment has its kind of genesis in the UK in 2010. Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister at the time, set up an outcome fund of £80 million. It was called the Chances or the Life Chances Fund. And the intention there was to use money that wasn't spent at the end of the year to use that for paying for outcomes. And they developed a number of impact bonds, which have grown quite a bit since then. There's about 280 outcome contracts or impact bonds across the world today. One of those is in sport, and it's been in existence for 3 years. That particular bond, it is called an impact bond, even though it's not a bond, has 16 sports clubs delivering 4 social outcomes. The financial model is that a private bank or a social bank called the Big Issue Invest provided the capital for these clubs to do the intervention. And there were 3 outcome payers who would pay for the outcomes when they were verified independently. So one outcome payer was Sport England, one was the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and the third outcome payer was 23 local authorities across England where these clubs existed. The 4 outcomes they had to achieve were a reduction in crime by children who were known to the police, a reduction in NEET. NEET stands for those who are not in education, employment or training, an improvement in physical literacy amongst girls at primary school level, and an improvement in educational attainment and attendance at primary school. So those 6,000 children needed to meet these outcomes over a 3-year period. And within 18 months, these clubs had attained most of the outcomes. The social investor had recouped all their money plus a dividend. The reason the bond came into play was they were able to evaluate the outcomes. They could put a price on the outcomes, and the government entities could see that for the 1.5 million of private investment that they were going to have to pay back, they were delivering 4 million of savings to the state. So that was the return that they were getting. UEFA is exploring 4 pilots today with 4 different countries, so Norway, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, on similar interventions: men's health, gender equality, education and general health. These are the types of outcome-based contracts that we're exploring. They're not SIBs. They'll also include the fact that the clubs can repay the finance themselves. So it's a little bit of kind of social enterprise, and it's also a little bit of impact-linked financing. So better financial terms for better outcomes. So the more outcomes you deliver, the better your financial terms will be. So it's really rewarding community agents that are delivering good activities for those who are most at risk. So maybe I should stop. You might have some questions, Julian.
Yes, going back to the original bond, it is not really a bond, you said. It is a outcome contract, let me say, between a variety of parties. Very interesting. So 2 concrete questions. What exactly was the intervention, and how were the 6,000 kids picked to participate?
Very good. So there were 13 football clubs. There was a boxing club, a gymnastics club, and like a yoga kind of lifestyle club. They were selected because there was a lot of confidence that these clubs could deliver. So these clubs had been delivering in their local communities year on year, and there was a lot of evidence. They'd captured a lot of data and so on. So there was confidence that the clubs could deliver. How the individuals were selected is important because getting 6,000 children to play football or go boxing is not a difficult thing. That's pretty easy to get. But when a teacher refers a little girl who's heavy to go to a boxing club or a gymnastics club because the teacher wants her to do better in school, that's a different type of referral. It's a different type of thing. So these children, 20% of that 6,000 were referrals by a teacher, a police officer, or a local youth officer. And they would have identified children that needed help in some capacity. The club then would have to find a way to engage with those young people differently. They didn't simply go boxing. They would do things like work on their self-esteem, work on writing CVs, doing their homework. So it's a very holistic approach. Sport is the hook, but then it's a very multidisciplinary approach to dealing with, complex children with complex problems. Sport is the hook, but it's not the only solution. There's a variety of things. Sport gets them in and keeps them, and then it's up to the entity then to deliver a more holistic service to the child then.
Sounds a bit like the combo package from before with homework, dinner and football, and this time CV and boxing.
Yeah.
And some hand-holding.
And what's interesting about the outcome contracting, Julian, is that when you design these contracts, you have to work with multiple agencies. So if, for example, the Ministry of Education are going to pay for an intervention or an outcome through sport, you need to engage with the education experts, the education budgets, because they need to know that their money is going towards an educational outcome. So in this world of impact investment, outcome contracting, the development of partnerships where people are working together to resolve complex issues. Yeah, that's the nuance that we generally forget about social impact investment, is one, that it does give cash to agencies that will do good work, but also it fosters partnerships that affect sustainable and systemic change as well.
Right, as you rightly point out, it is having 6,000 kids play football and having a list of them is easy, but having kids who otherwise wouldn't convince to do football or gymnastics or yoga or anything really that involves physical activity it can be remarkably difficult. And I see how a partnership between school and clubs and other parties could be instrumental in doing that.
And maybe for a further point, Julian, the boxing club that I'd mentioned, they're called Bright Star. They went through a process of a theory of change whereby they wanted to identify what was the single biggest influence in getting these children to come. And they discovered that when they bought a bus and collected the children who were in the inner cities, who hadn't got, a positive parental influence, that was key for them, because the children would not come to the boxing club, even though it was only a kilometre over the road. They would not go on public transport. They would not come out the door unless the coach came and collected them. And once they had done that for 6, 7, 8 weeks, their self-esteem and confidence grew, and then they didn't need that support. But with impact investment, as opposed to, for example, grants, you're continuously adapting so that you can reach the outcome, and you're continually delivering on insights to see what is the most effective intervention action that you can take. I think that's an important element as well.
That is an essential element in getting these things right. I appreciate your point. And when we spoke before, you highlighted, we had this discussion about putting high-powered incentives on social outcomes, and then it creates sometimes, and there's concern for people to try to cheat. And I think you called it creaming or skimming. That was the thing when you sort of try to access the kids who are easy and try to leave the others out of the statistics, and then everything looks fantastic. And that's, of course, something that's problematic. Your point about people working together to really come together and design those interventions so that they really work is, of course, an interesting counter argument, right? That it also creates incentives to do that if it's set up properly from the start. And grants, in opposition to that, because that's the normal way how money is being given out by the public sector, you were saying for grants, there isn't really any evidence at all that this creates positive outcomes.
Yeah, the evidence is very likely. So grants are a really, really important element of funding the third sector or the community voluntary sector in a country. And it allows, brilliant volunteers and community organisations to do good. Yet the way grants are set up, they're quite rigorous in terms of the application. So there's a lot of work done in terms of making sure that the entity in receipt of the money is a responsible agency and that the money will go towards what is intended. But the challenge sometimes with grants is that, you're paying for an activity or a facility. So, for example, if you get €1 million for a new sports hall in a local Gemeinde in Switzerland, you just have to show that the roof cost X and the windows cost Y and the floor cost Z, and you go and you build it. Or you might get money to do coaching programs. So you'll say we will deliver 100 coaching courses for volunteers across Switzerland, and you'll get the money for that, and that's fantastic. But ultimately, what good has happened because of that? That the football pitch or the swimming hall could be empty, 12 hours a day. It could be the same people that was swimming 20 years ago that are swimming today. That what change has happened? And with impact investment and outcome contracting, you're reversing it a little bit, saying that, okay, government should pay, but they should only pay when there has been a benefit. It's good, it's responsible from a taxpayer perspective. That de-risks things for government because, they are only paying when there is a benefit for society. So grants are good, but there are alternative ways. The Government Outcomes Lab in the University of Oxford were set up about 6 or 7 years ago to research the evidence around the impact of social outcome contracting. And you're right, they identified where people were cheating and creaming, skimming, cherry picking did take place. And, over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a lot more detail on contracts whereby there is more value to the sports club or the entity in going after the person who's most at risk. So, in unemployment outcome contracts, if you achieve an outcome whereby someone who is in long-term unemployment gains employment, that's of much more value to the state than somebody who's only unemployed for 3 months. So there's a better price for that particular outcome. So you contract so that the most difficult social outcome is of a higher financial value. Yeah, so the grants should be complemented. Our view is that we believe that there are other entities in the world today from the corporate sector and philanthropy that haven't traditionally been able to invest in sport because it's not a market where you can invest in. With outcome-based contracting and impact investment, we are trying to create almost like a marketplace where you can buy and sell outcomes. We have the evidence to show that these outcomes are, there's a risk that they may not happen, but we can give a percentage on that. We can give a price to the outcome, and then hopefully we can allow government and investors come together and talk about, how we can buy and sell outcomes through sport.
Yes, and I think that element of innovation and trying and improving both within the intervention. So how do you then convince kids to do something, and how do you write better contracts and specify the conditions more precisely to prevent some sort of unintended consequence of this incentive scheme? So I think both of these learning processes are really, really interesting and really can move us ahead. Now, the interventions we've been speaking about were in amateur football or amateur sports, broadly speaking. Now, of course, we have the European Championship going on. Everybody's watching. I am watching anyways. So I wanted to ask, what is the link between pro and amateur football? I read there's a very interesting paper by Alex Edmonds, Diego Garcia, and Øyvind Norley that they show that national stock markets, they actually go up when the national team wins, and they go down when the national team loses. So clearly the national sentiment is very much connected to how the national team does. So if it can move stock markets, do you think it can also move people to play more sports, or are they just watching and drinking beer?
Yeah, there's definitely evidence to show the economic upturn because of the activity. Even like tomorrow night, I will go and watch Switzerland play Italy in my local restaurant. They have a little bar set up behind, and I'll buy 2 or 3 drinks that I probably wouldn't have bought only for that game. So there's clearly an improvement in the economic activity. And my son, even though he's supposed to be Irish, he's a real big Jan Sommer fan, and I'll have to buy a T-shirt for him eventually, because he's seen so much of it on TV. So yeah, there's a clear link. And I remember a study that was done in Germany the last time they hosted I think it was the World Cup in 2006. And they did see an increase in football participation because of the tournament. And even things like when you've got the Olympics and so on, when you watch tennis or athletics, you're kind of motivated to go and do it again. The trick really is that maintaining that. And, sometimes the sports organisations aren't ready for new members or that uplift. And what UEFA has done over the last number of championships and indeed Champions Leagues and so on, we build legacy into the proposals. So we will work with host cities and countries to see what are they doing in advance of the tournament and what do they do afterwards, because it's really important to make the most of that event. Then of course there's an economic return and there's more bed nights and more entertainment, but really you want to have a more active community, more investment in local sport and so on. The IOC doesn't have a lot of research on the long-term impact because it costs a lot of money to keep doing studies on a thing that happened 4 or 5 or 10 years ago. And we probably have to invest more in that. But yeah, there's no doubt more boys and girls will play football after the summer because of the Euros, and it's a brilliant spectacle. And the same will happen with the games in Paris too.
Yes. No, clearly it is motivating to see just the aesthetics of, seeing the very best ones play that sport. And if the next facility isn't too far, or you have a couple of friends who ask you, then I think that it brings you over the bump, no doubt, every now and then. But in connection to that, do you think football's positive impacts on society are a really particular feature also, through the connection to the very successful pro leagues? Or do you think that other sports clubs, other sports, less popular sports perhaps, or even completely different activities like music will have actually quite similar impacts? Or do you think there's something quite unique about football per se?
If you go back to one of the first questions you asked, Julian, was about football as medicine. I had mentioned Professor Peter Krustrup, and he's analysed other sports, including weights training and interval training, plus a variety of different other sports. And his research shows that there is much more multi-directional movement in football than other sports. So you do actually have an increased physical output in football. That's the kind of scientific answer. The more anecdotal is the fact that football is the global sport. It's really easy to organise. It's extremely popular. So it's got a really big base already. There are massive areas for improvement. There are lots of men and women, boys and girls who actually don't play football for whatever reason. They might have had a bad experience at the beginning. There wasn't a place for them on a team. There was a bad coach. So there's lots for what we can do to improve how football is organised and run and delivered so that people enjoy the game for longer. I think that's the biggest challenge for all sports, is what's called LISPA, so life involvement in sport and physical activity. All sports need to cultivate physical literacy and an appetite and a motivation to be physically active. And we all need to work on that. The competition nature of sport, the fact that we compete against each other, can lead to drop-off because not everybody wants competition. So there needs to be sport as recreation. There needs to be sport as social, as health, as improvement. So we can use sport for development. UNESCO are really good on this. They have a program called Fit for Life. It's a new program which is really about trying to show that sport for development is more important, and it should be the base for everything. Football's got a big advantage because of its popularity, but other sports can do so much as well.
Football's also really easy in terms of the rules. And as you say, you just need a bit of, grass that's not too long, and then you put in 2 sticks. I mean, it is quite easy in terms of setting up a game. I think that is certainly something in favor of it. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Liam, for this tour of the impacts of sports. Very inspiring. I think it is an important topic that, at least in my mind, hadn't gotten enough attention. I'll be thinking of that more. We also have a weekly recreational football game at St. Gallen that I irregularly attend, but now now that I know all the positive benefits, I should be going more for sure.
Fantastic.
To finish up, I have really just 2 questions for you. So first, who do you think will win this year's Euro Cup? I want to have your pick. And second, more seriously, what sort of developments in football would you love to see until the next championship or so in 4 years?
So I've only got to see the late kickoffs because with 4 young kids, so they're the games that suit me. But my heart would like to go for the likes of Georgia, who've never been there before, such a small country. But realistically, I think it's going to be hard to beat the Germans at home. The big countries will always be there or thereabouts. Switzerland have a chance. I think they're playing well. They're really good right down the middle, from their goalkeepers, centre halves, the centre midfield. They're really, really solid. But it's very hard to beat the Germans at home, so I'll probably go with Germany. In terms of what I'm looking forward to, in terms of the looking forward, next year Switzerland hosts the Women's Euros, and I think it'd be fantastic for people, first of all, to come and see Switzerland. I have lots of friends that they only come to Switzerland because of the Alps and skiing. And there's so much more to Switzerland than that. And so I think exposing Switzerland to a wider audience that would never have come to the country is great. But also for women and girls to look at the talent and the improvements in women's football. Like if women and girls get the same chances to play football as boys do, getting to play 3 or 4 times a week from 7 years old, like the game is just going to get better and better and better. And I'm a fan of FCV. I'm a season ticket holder at Winterthur, and it's lovely going to the stadium because there are so many women in the stadium. It's a different atmosphere and audience than going to the Premier League or whatever. So having women involved in football, both in playing, consuming, administering, and fans, it's so much better for the sport.
Great vision for the future. Thank you so much, Liam, and for all the interesting stories. And thanks for being on the podcast. I enjoyed it very, very much.
It's my pleasure, Julian, and really well done on the podcast.
Thank you. And for other listeners who perhaps listen to this and think, hey, I should be on the podcast too, I think this is a great example. Please do reach out. I really enjoy connecting, of course, with you, my listeners. So I hope you liked the episode, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. Innovations in Sustainable Finance, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Julian Kölbel.